I've just shown you two functionalities that I hope you agree are powerful and that we have shown are desired by users and are pretty easy to integrate into existing social platforms in theory. They don't require massive re-architecting. They're just adding a property to each post or sort of forwarding a message to an intermediary. Right? Unfortunately, we cannot deploy these things into the existing platform because the platforms are closed. And it's too hard for us to launch our own social network where we could provide these sorts of functionalities. Or can we launch our own social network where we would provide these functionalities? So what is a social network really? Well, it's a bunch of messages in a variety of formats being delivered to users who want to see them. And some sort of query that selects and ranks those messages into a user's feed. And then some sort of client to look at the results and create new content. And so Theia is going to talk to you about how we can provide that sort of capability to anybody who wants to just create their own social network to provide whatever kind of social network functionalities they think will be useful to their community. Theia, go ahead.
Okay, so while this is getting set up, I will also point out, so the slides here are a website, and this talk is going to be interactive, so you can also visit them at graffiti.csale.mit.edu. So yeah, this talk is titled Graffiti, the Potential for Anarchism in the Design of Social Applications. And so again, here's that link. We'll come back to this. So just to reiterate very briefly what David said, social media today can be a lot of things. It can be addicting, it can be depressing, it can be enraging, it can be a vector for disinformation, lots of bad things. And so there's this general question of, can we do any better? And so throughout this workshop, we've seen a lot of examples that point to yes. So yesterday we saw Amy Zheng's systems policy kit and filter bubble, and these are new ways to do like user-based moderation. Nitesh showed us Harassment Manager, which is using AI to empower victims of online harassment. And Squadbox also is empowering users of online harassment. And then Farnaz just showed us TrustNet, which has the power to basically use your own social network to reduce the mis and disinformation that you're exposed to. So, and it's not just, these radical, crazy new systems. Just giving individuals and communities autonomy over their own designs can have powerful effects as well. And so, for example, just giving users the ability to customize their keyboard in a group chat has been shown to create a greater sense of intimacy in those interactions they have there. Casey, when she's not working on copyright issues, has also done some interesting work studying this particular online community called Archive of Our Own, which is a fan fiction site that is designed by and for the community. And it has, and she showed that, this sort of community-based design has better supported the needs and values of the community. And finally, just, when we give individuals power over their social spaces, they can do crazy and creative things. And I'll just reminisce to MySpace, which was kind of before my time. But, there was also Tumblr to some extent. Lots of cool options. So why are most people still using harmful and boring applications? And the basic answer is it's what their friends use. I can't switch to a different application even if I want to, because then I would have no friends. And that is a very large cost, and so this causes network lock-in. And so there's a general approach, and one that I think a number of people have addressed in this workshop, that I'm going to call and so, yeah, what can we do about this? So a general approach that I'm going to call the socialist approach, that seems to be most of what we can do. And in this approach, we're going to affect change through some sort of collective action. And so, for example, this might mean writing petitions or legislation that will change the existing platforms. It might mean that I'm going to create an entirely new platform, and then I need to convince everyone to collectively switch to that new application. And these can work in some cases, but it's inevitably slow, and it requires a lot of sustained collective effort because you need to get a lot of group support to do these things. And using the metaphor that some people used yesterday, this is often solving problems that are in the rearview mirror. It's just too slow, and it's only really capable of solving really large problems. Like if I want, a different color scheme, that's not a great. It would probably be hard to get like a big petition or legislation signed that is going to enact my new color scheme. And so for this reason, we have created this system called Graffiti, which is an infrastructure that arguably any social application can be built on top of. And these applications, if they have overlapping functionality, will naturally interoperate. And I want to clarify that Graffiti is not integrating existing platforms. It is something entirely new. I'm not trying to take your Facebook and your Twitter and kind of merge them. So Farnaz was doing some of that when she had these browser extensions, and that was kind of integrating with the current ecosystem. So this is basically a prototype of, okay, what if we didn't have those constraints? What could we do? And so this basically unlocks a new approach that I'm going to call the Anarchist Approach. And so in this approach, we can affect change independently or through voluntary collaboration. We do not need to have any sort of approval or agreement to get things done. So for example, I could use, design, or customize whatever interfaces, filters, algorithms, moderators, or broadcast patterns that I want. And so this not only gives you a lot of autonomy, but on the kind of ecosystem level, this means a lot of different designs can be explored and iterated on in parallel, which can lead to faster evolution of the design. So social media has kind of looked mostly the same for like a decade. And I feel like the design we have now is probably not the best. I assume there's something else out there. But it's hard to find it when we don't have the option to really explore different designs and change around. So what does this look like? So I said this can support any sort of social application. So how about a social network in a slideshow? So I hope you have gone to this URL up here. So again, that is graffiti.csale.mit.edu, and then the fragment for this slide is #login. And so if you go to the next slide, you'll see this login button. And so I'm going to click this, and I will be redirected to a login server. You can log in via email. And so I know there are some privacy people in this room, and so you just got to trust me that I'm only storing a salted hash of your email, and no password. And so I'm just going to click this login link on my phone, and I should be redirected. Great. And so now that I'm logged in, I am going to create a name. And I'll say my name is Theia. Whoop, that didn't work. Why didn't that work? Okay, cool. By the way, this is in very much an alpha stage, so hopefully you do not crash the server by all logging in at once, but we will see. Okay, and so if we go on to the next slide, now maybe we can have a little basic forum. So I could say, my cool question, and then post that. Oh no, it is really slow. No. Is this working for anyone? Okay. Well, that's not the best. Performance has not been the thing that we've been designing for so far, so this is, I guess, a test. Oh, so it did work for somebody. Okay, great. Well, I'm going to like your post, hopefully. Okay, moving on. All right, so the implementation is a work in progress, but the theory is something we've been working on for a while. And so I'm going to describe basically how this is, what exactly is happening here. So in our design, we are basically trying to make everything, making no assumptions. Basically all of the assumptions about, how you're going to sort things, how you're going to have moderation, et cetera, how you're going to organize things, that's all going to be the user's choice. And so social data in our system is composed of independent objects. So posts, likes, relationships, and all of those things are just these unique blobs of data. They have unique identifiers, so they can be pointed to, just kind of like hypertext. And this makes composition of these objects into structures very modular. Now, users can only modify their own objects, and this means that if you want moderation or collaboration or something, this is essentially just an interpretation of the data. I might interpret somebody's block as removing my post. Someone else could interpret it as just flagging the post, depending on maybe the identity of that person, and another person might just ignore it altogether. So the data objects themselves lack an intrinsic schema. And so we're not, again, making any assumptions about what this data entails, like whether it's posts or likes, and hopefully some sort of schema will naturally evolve as a folksonomy. And this is similar to activity streams, which is related to the ActivityPub protocol, which I'll talk about at the end. That's what underlies Mastodon. And so in addition to having no intrinsic schema, data also has no extrinsic schema. And so the way that we form collections of objects is going to be from queries. And so I'll pause here and say that essentially what I've described so far is basically just a shared database. It's maybe an interesting shared database, but it's essentially just this collection of objects that you're putting things into and making queries. And what makes this a more social structure is a notion of contextual boundaries, which I will come to at the end. But first, I'm going to give a quick demo, just kind of illustrating the first part of this, how you can create social applications just by making queries on this shared database. So, okay, it worked for some people, great. So here is an example of making a little social application, and we have this declarative language where you can basically write these things in some sort of Frankenstein of HTML and Vue.js and MongoDB. And so here we have I'm creating a collection. And this is basically a query, and I'm looking for things that are posts. I want to make sure that post has some sort of content, and I want to make sure it adheres by a certain tags, which are Graffiti and DIMACS. And then the page size, this is just how many I'm preloading, and I'm also making it live, so it live updates. And then here I'm basically just iterating over the collection that I've created and just displaying the posts. Okay, cool. So what if I also want to display likes? So I could create another query within this loop. So maybe this will be called likes. And now I'm going to look for things that have a type like. And they're going to be referencing the post that they are liking. And so that's going to be the post.id. That is a system field. And I need to close this tag. Okay, and so in addition to the content, I can say how many likes this has. So this post has likes.objects.length likes. Let's see if that worked. Nobody likes anything. Oh, this one has one like. That's cool. And So in addition to just kind of creating these recursive queries, we can also use these to filter the data in some way. And so maybe I only want to see things that have likes. And so I could do an if here, and I could do if something has likes, then display it. And now we're only seeing things with likes. I could even make it more restrictive, only the things with 2 likes. And so here I'm using likes, but we could also do this with other forms of data. Maybe it's dislikes. Maybe I'm now going to be removing content that people don't like. And maybe I am making this query in reference to somebody's particular identifier, and I'm setting them as a moderator. So like in Squadbox, we would give different permissions to our friends, and I might do something like that here. And so again, this is all the user's choice. Okay, so yeah, just to clarify, this is, David doesn't like this phrasing, this is moderation as interpretation. So you can imagine that you are sort of subscribing to moderators, just like you can follow someone or subscribe to someone on many social platforms now. Like imagine in a system where you could subscribe to someone's moderation. And maybe you're giving power to friends, maybe you give some other power to community leaders, and maybe there are some like public options, some large like AI systems that are going to go and tag things, and I could just choose which ones I want to use with regards to my own posts. And then maybe you'll have some other higher level structure on top of this, like policy kit. Okay, so that is the basic database aspect of this. So I also mentioned there's this notion of context. So when we communicate, we form mental models of who our audience is, what these people are interested in, what conversational norms do they expect, and we shape what we say based on these models. I am shaping what I'm saying right now to, knowing that you guys know things about CS and law. It's not the type of talk I would give to my mom. The way that we form these models is largely based on context cues. So I don't know all of you, but I know the context that we exist in. When I say context, I'm talking about an abstract place and the identities, situations, and norms that are going to be associated with that place. And online, we have lots of different contexts. So a context might be an app itself. So things happen on Twitter, and there is some sort of culture associated with Twitter. Things happen in categories within those apps, like channels or subreddits, or within hashtags, there can be certain discussions. Things can happen in the context of a person, like things that happen on my profile. Things can happen in the context of other things, like a comment section is essentially that. Things can happen in a hierarchy. We have threads and directory structures. Things can happen in a physical space, or in the context of a physical space, so like Yik Yak, online dating apps do things like this, on and on, lots of different types of context. But what is a place when my data can show up in many different queries? And so we've essentially broken that right now. If I can just kind of ask for whatever data I want, I'm not going to know if you're seeing this data because it has a tag or if you're like my friend and you're interested in stuff like me. And this is going to create this phenomenon called context collapse. And when people experience context collapse, they can either overly censor themselves or end up annoying and being censored by other people. And this is already the case on many social media platforms. It is the reason I do not use Twitter. I am followed both by some academics and also my Ratchet Hoe friends. And I don't even comment or like on their posts because on Twitter, if I do that, it can end up in the feed of other people's posts or other people's feeds that are following me. But this could get much worse. So here we're collapsing everything all into one stream, and we really don't want to do that. But context, we mostly think about it as this extrinsic property. There's the thing, and then there's the place that this thing exists in. But this extrinsic organization might need, you can imagine like a directory structure. You might think that one folder goes inside another folder, but I might disagree. I might think it's the opposite. And so there's going to be necessary conflicts between different sort of extrinsic structures that people might impose on a system. And we are trying to make zero assumptions about what the right answer is. And so we are going to have context as an intrinsic property of the data. And the way you can think about this is that the data is essentially saying, I only want people to see, this post if people are specifically looking for something. So if people are specifically looking for things by me, now I know that my audience is like people who follow me, maybe. Like they're looking at essentially my profile. If it's things that refer to an article, now I know that people are looking in this comment section. This is the type of context I wish I had control over on Twitter. I would love to be able to just comment on things and know that it wasn't going to end up in my profile. And things can also happen in the context of some particular category, and now it's like I'm talking in a channel. So we can generalize this and say, okay, what I want is I only want people to see my post if their query is sufficiently specific. And so this, to database people, might seem kind of counterintuitive, because what this means is the smaller I make my query, the more data I might get. But this is a social database, not necessarily a computational database, and I think this is a more social phenomenon. So for example, if I were to ask, or if Alice was to ask a question like, how are you? Bob might just respond with fine. That's like a normal response. Alice's question was very vague. I'm going to give a vague answer. But a database might just give its whole life history because the query was essentially just asking for everything. And so just in the way we speak as well, we only will talk about things if people are asking specifically enough. So how are we going to describe these in our data model? So taking some terminology from classical AI systems, we're using this concept of near misses. And so essentially what this means is if I have my piece of data, I'm going to specify some other piece of data that is very close to my original piece of data, but it differs in some way. And I'm going to say, okay, this is my original data, this is in context. This is some other data, this is out of context. And now, let's say someone makes a really broad query, and it gets both of these pieces of data are hit by the query. What I'm going to do in that case is I am not going to return this, or the system is not going to return this, because by both of these being true, my query is too vague. But if my query was more specific, for example, if my query was only captured the post that I'm, then this would return true in the query, and this would return false, and then in this case, the system would return the post. And so we're using this system because it is agnostic basically to the query language, and you can extend this to many different types of logical intersections of basically different types of contexts that people might want to create. And so for example, here just a little interactive thing. So I'm sorry, this is small. If I have a post which has, my ID, it has some content, it's in reply to something, and it has some tags associated with it. So if my context is, oh no, we really did break the server. Are any of these gonna work? They're not gonna work. Oh wait, I'm not logged in. That would do it. Sorry. Okay, sorry. We'll just move on. And that's basically the system. So it's an unstructured and shared database with these intrinsic contextual boundaries. And all of the computation or interpretation of the data is chosen by the user. Nothing is assumed. So there's also two things I didn't mention. One, in addition to near misses, we also have this concept of neighbors, which is the opposite of being sufficiently specific. It's sufficiently vague. And you can also get access control using these context mechanisms as well. And so I guess the main question is this enough? And so I guess this is what we're trying to study. Currently, the server is under development rapidly, and things are changing all the time. So anytime I make a demo, it usually breaks in a week. So that is future work to get much more realistic and diverse examples. OK, so I guess just to wrap up. So first of all, I just kind of like to, I think the metaphor of the title gives a good impression of the system. So graffiti is this very unstructured art form. It can kind of happen anywhere. The art itself is very unstructured. And well, it also has these ties to anarchism. But it is also a medium where the context is an intrinsic part of the medium. So you could take a painting and you could put it somewhere else. But graffiti is tied to a particular place, and oftentimes that is used as part of the art itself. And so, for example, this is some art that was outside of my door when I was in an undergraduate dorm. And so, for example, here we have greetings from outer space, and it's written on the skylight. And so, this is kind of playing on the fact that, it is where it is. And then also, there's this other quote, which is marking the space in some way. And I can't entirely describe the context of why this made so much sense in the space, because again, it is contextual. But I don't know. This is just kind of the poetic reason of why it is named this. And so I guess I'll briefly go over some related work. I think it makes sense to do this at the end now that you know what the system is. So Solid is an extension of the Semantic Web project, and it's a system where you have a pod, you can put data in it, and you can take your pod and you can plug it into an application, and then that data reads and writes to your pod. But at any point, you can unplug it and plug it into another application, and now that data is using your stuff. So it's giving you a lot of data portability, but it's not fixing the network effect, because when we're unplugging something from one pod and plugging it into another, we're not bringing over our friend's data with us. So ActivityPub is the protocol that underlies Mastodon. And so the way it works, it is essentially a fusion of broadcast and messaging. You have an inbox and an outbox, and you live on a server. And your server also has an inbox and outbox. And this makes communication really easy if you know who you want to talk to, or if you're talking to people within your server. But it's not great for communities that overlap, and it's not great for communities that kind of pop up spontaneously, like a comment section. And Web3, I guess there's a lot to say about that, but something isn't necessarily better just because it's decentralized. And these are some questions that maybe we can discuss later, but would this be a haven for hate groups? Any sort of very open space seems to be a target for that. And so I would argue that having so many diverse and overlapping views on the same data has the ability to kind of dampen these effects, because not everyone is just going to be in the same echo chamber. If left to their own devices, would people just make social media even more addictive and engaging? I think that is something that really needs to be studied, because this could be just an enormous drug. We talked about friction yesterday. Would people just remove all of the healthy friction? And so I guess one comment I have to that is the friction basically a Band-Aid on the systems that are already broken? Is friction we would still need? And then, is it possible to decentralize this? And I would actually also wonder, does that necessarily matter? Would a democratically run nonprofit suffice? And I guess finally, how would a system like this gain adoption? This is an entirely new ecosystem. It is not interacting with what already exists, so there has to be some collective action to get there. And how would you do it? So with that, I will let David wrap up.
Hi. Oop. Cool talk. I think this is actually very neat, so thank you. I guess my question is, so if this caught on and Graffiti got a lot of users who made a lot of posts and the shared database got very large, do you have thoughts on how you would choose to like still be able to retrieve enough info that people want within a reasonable amount of time while preserving the like anybody could in theory access, you know, anything in this entire database problem? I'm asking sort of a efficiency at scale question, considering your like philosophical goals.
Yes. Wait, sorry, are you asking about access control where people can just access anything in this?
More an efficiency question where if you have Facebook scale numbers of people here, but you still want every query to be able to potentially, you know, touch anything in the very large database, like how do you choose to divvy this up into a more, you know, something that could respond within seconds?
Performance is definitely an issue. I don't necessarily have an answer to that. I hope it could be done. Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
I mean, I would posit that most uses of this would involve somebody defining a social network which hard codes a specific set of queries. And so you could then optimize for those in order to support that particular social network. And just as a new social network arrives, you would have a new optimization to do.
Yeah.
So forgive me if I didn't put pieces of the presentation together to see what the answer to this one is. I'm wondering how you deal with determined attempts to scrape data by issuing large numbers of queries, each of which is specific, with the idea that the person who has unlimited resources to gather data just issues lots of queries to avoid your near misses.
Yeah, so the context, there is a way to do access control, and that's basically, it has to do with the fact that just as we add an ID field, there's also certain fields we limit in terms of the data that people can post. There's also like a by field, which is their own identity. And when you make a query, you can only query for a to field that is your own identity. So that in combination with the context can get you like actual access control. But in terms of the obfuscation that you get from just like, you know, I'm not going to see this just because I'm not making the right query. So there are many things online that are public to some extent, and that people are, I guess, comfortable being public, but it is kind of the social phenomenon of, I do not want people to see this because, one, for their sake, because I don't think they're interested in it, and two, for my sake of like, okay, if you're going out of the way to stalk me, sure, you can know this, but it's not something I'm just like looking to tell you. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess I worry about the intermediary who decides to make it their business to de-obfuscate in bulk for lots of people.
David's brought this up before. Maybe David has a response.
Yeah, I think my response would be that I don't expect most people to want to consume what that intermediary is providing, right? That this is not access control. This is sort of social sort of being nice with your friends, right? Like, I try to avoid oversharing, right? And I want to guide my friends to the information that they would like to see, right? But I'm not trying to prevent them from finding out more. They're welcome to ask me more, but I don't want to force on them. Okay? If somebody goes digging and finds out everything and somebody else wants to find everything, that's fine. If there's something we don't want them to find out, that's what access control is for. But this is really much more about sort of smooth social interaction.
I guess there's also the social implication of if there is data that you find that, you know, you had to look in a specific place to find it, I either know that you've been in that place or that you've essentially been trying to stalk me. And so there is kind of a social stigma against that. And so a lot of people would not reveal the fact that they have done this willingly.
I saw another hand, but now I've lost it. Oh, thank you.
I love this project. I mean, I think I really love it because it's, it just reminds me of like my beginnings with like free and open source software, and I feel like this is a really cool like free and open source, you know, social network. And I guess a couple of questions that I had for you was, again, like just thinking about this in the context of, free and open source software. Like, I think some of the questions you brought about just with regards to adoption and like how that's hard. Yeah. But how is this different from, say, the current sort of like open social networks that exist, like Diaspora and Mastodon, which are, besides the fact that this is centralized and not decentralized, like what are the other things that you see as requiring sort of a separate, like a new social network, right? Like not using the existing like kernel that they have and like building on top of that, but actually requiring like a whole new endeavor. And the other question that I had was, how do you see this being used by, entities like states and like government officials, right, who now currently use spaces like Twitter to also communicate with the public? Like, do you think the space is like open to them as well, or do you see any issues with that? So I think those were my two questions.
Okay, first on the decentralized spaces. So that's kind of what I was talking about with ActivityPub. So ActivityPub is the protocol that underlies Mastodon and a lot of the Fediverse. And so that and Diaspora, although I haven't looked at Diaspora in a long time, are essentially messaging protocols to some extent, or messaging and broadcast protocols. And this is really good for when you know who you want to talk to or who you want to look at data from. And so they tend to form these clique-like communities that are, and so on Mastodon in particular, you tend to associate with people on your server. And so in some sense, this is conflating hardware with community. And oftentimes, maybe in some hacker groups, that's the same thing. But for a lot of people, they're not just kind of in one circle. They're in many circles, and the boundaries between them are fuzzy. And that's kind of where this sort of breaks down. And also finding people who you do not already know. Like, that is the big power of many social networks, finding things like friends of a friend, people who are nearby, people who are interested in the same things as you. And so you lose that ability of these kind of spontaneous interactions if you're only communicating with people who you kind of already know to ping. And the second question, I'm sorry, could you remind me real quick?
Yeah, sorry, I was asking about states and government officials who, I don't know, sometimes have vested interests, but also who are in sort of more official positions. Like, do you see any sort of barrier? Like, or do you? I think I'm curious about how you see them influencing the space, because.
Yeah. So I think there's a lot to discuss about kind of what regulations could be put on this. Like, are there things people need to include in their clients? There's also, as Becca was talking about yesterday, the senator, like, there's these requirements that senators cannot moderate some things, and they get flooded with lots of harassment. And so in a system like this, I guess there is the opportunity of people can say things, but I might not necessarily look at it, because again, the filters and the moderation is all kind of a personal view. This speech is still out there. Yeah.
Yeah, I actually think Becca's problem is a beautiful example of what could work well here, because if Becca were on a platform like Graffiti, right, Becca could annotate certain messages as toxic, and Becca could also advertise to her constituents that they should not bother looking at messages that Becca has annotated as toxic. Now, this is not moderation. The messages are still there. It is entirely up to the individual users to decide whether to pay attention to Becca or not. There is no restriction of speech, but the people she actually wants to communicate with would be insulated from the toxicity that she was facing.
We probably have time for one more question. Anybody out there on Zoom wants to ask one question?
Okay.
Thank you very much. That was all really